Welcome to the first video in the King's Ash General's weekly Eastern Front series. Last week we finished our 12-episode-long prelude with a study of the German war plans and preparations for Operation Barbarossa. This week we will cover the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, beginning on June 22, 1941. Before we begin, a short note from our team. The scale of the campaigns we're now beginning to dive into is enormous. Although distances are comparable to our Pacific War series, the nature of these campaigns being a land war means that many more troops participated in them. Millions of men on each side, arrayed in hundreds of divisions and thousands of regiments. We cannot possibly cover every movement of every unit in the space we have here. That being said, we're striving to bring you the best operational military history content available anywhere. We intend to give as much detail as possible to the campaigns, and in practice, this means that we will be speaking of the movements of corps and armies. Occasionally, divisions will briefly be the focus of the narrative. Regiments and other smaller units may be mentioned, but they will not be the focus. As the war progresses, there will be times when the action has slowed across the vast distances of the Eastern Front, and we can zoom in onto smaller units to give a grittier perspective on the war. However, in most cases, this will be the exception. Thank you for starting this journey with us. Let's begin. The mass of the soldiers of the Heer was not aware that Operation Barbarossa even existed until the late afternoon of June 21st. Only then did they read a proclamation from Hitler that told them that the inevitable war would be fought. This was stunning news for most of the soldiers, but many reacted with confidence. Few expressed any fear. Many had understood that this day might come. The general attitude of the soldiers was one of grim determination. Convinced of the ideological righteousness of their invasion, they set to work, ensuring that they would be ready. The start time was set for just a few hours away, in some cases, as little as 6 hours from when they had heard Hitler's message. The attack began with the opening artillery salvos just after 0300. The dawn was just beginning in the northern regions of the country. Luftwaffe bombers screeched overhead, heading to ammunition depots, headquarters, and other key targets. The entire Soviet military was caught by surprise at the tactical level. No alert had gone out to the frontline troops. Bridges were left undefended, and artillery wasn't manned. Planes stood idle on the tarmac, unprepared for operation. Field Marshal Lieb's Army Group North's area of operations ran from Memel on the coast to just northwest of Suwałki in the south. The far left flank was under the control of Colonel General Küchler's 18th Army. His divisions moved across the border with little fanfare, as the artillery preparations had been concentrated in the areas opposite of the panzer groups. Küchler had 6 infantry divisions on a frontage of about 100 kilometers, as well as 1 in reserve. Opposite this force, the Red Army mustered just 3 rifle divisions in 2 corps. Of these, the 10th Rifle Division had a frontage of nearly 80 of the 100 kilometers being assaulted by the 18th Army. By midday, Küchler was able to report that his forces had advanced between 8 and 10 kilometers across his entire front. It was his estimation that many of the forward Soviet units were not in position, as expected by the High Command of the German Army, OKH. The fighting had been fierce in several of the border towns, but overall, resistance was gauged as light in view of the expectations. Still, notable successes were elusive everywhere in this sector, with the exception of the independent 291st Infantry Division on the far left of Küchler's force. The division was storming through confused Soviet positions, and by the end of the first day had made it nearly 65 kilometers. Crossing the entirety of the Lithuania countryside in front of it, the 291st Infantry was now in possession of the bridgehead into Latvia. The rest of the 18th Army had made respectable progress through the end of the day. The other 5 frontline divisions of the army, the 1st, 11th, 21st, 61st, and 217th Infantry, had endured some hard fighting in spots, but generally had not encountered particularly stiff resistance. On the right of the 18th Army was the 4th Panzer Group, under Colonel General Hübner. He had 602 tanks in 3 panzer divisions, divided between 2 corps commanders, General Manstein in command of the 56th Panzer Corps and General Reinhardt commanding the 41st Panzer Corps. Manstein had one objective: push his troops to the critical bridge over the Dubisa River at Ariagala. The lead element of Manstein's force was Major General Brandenberger's 8th Panzer Division. They ran into stiff resistance led by the 125th Rifle Division around the town of Gidzai, only 13 kilometers from the border. Efforts were made to bypass the town. Late in the evening, the 56th Panzer Corps halted for the day. The Corps had moved men and tanks 92 kilometers from its starting point, achieving all of its objectives. Gidzai had held up major elements only temporarily, falling in the late afternoon. Meanwhile, the 41st Panzer Corps was attacking on the left flank of the Panzer Group. Struggles ensued as the Red Army fought doggedly in wooded areas all along the attack route. Ultimately, Reinhardt's corps could not reach all of its objectives for this day, falling short of the crossings at Rasenai. On the southern flank of Army Group North was the 16th Army, commanded by Colonel General Butch. The 16th Army had a front of 100 kilometers. They needed to push back the Soviet 16th Rifle Corps all along this front in order to protect the flank of the advancing panzers to its left. Initially, the Soviets fell back in some disorder. At some point, communications were lost with some of the 16th Rifle Corps' subordinate units. As elsewhere in this sector, as the day progressed, resistance stiffened. German small unit commanders reported being attacked from areas that had been bypassed throughout the day. Nowhere was truly secure, and the Heer would soon come to learn that this was the case everywhere in the Soviet Union. Especially in this sector, small bands of Red Army soldiers were surprising their opponents with their determination and skill. It was clear to all that this campaign was not going to be like France. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the 16th Army had achieved real success. Its divisions had made better than expected progress in some areas, and nowhere had they been seriously held up. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Bock was the main effort of the entire campaign. Accordingly, they also had the widest frontage and the most resources. Bock's lines ran from Suvlaki in the north to the would-be infamous Pripyat marshes in the south. The left flank was anchored by General Hott, commanding the 3rd Panzer Group. Bock's advance was preceded by a significant artillery barrage and Luftwaffe close air support hammering the positions of the 11th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Morozov. He had not put all of his forces on the border, and instead had layered them behind it. This prevented them from being overrun in their entirety on this first day, even when parts of the 57th Panzer Corps managed to advance 70 kilometers. Hott also had 2 infantry corps under his command, the 5th and 6th. These corps moved more slowly than their mounted comrades, and didn't make it across the border until 0400. This did not stop them from foot marching an incredible 40 kilometers before they halted for the day, while also having endured some measure of combat along the way. Hott's other Panzer Corps was the 39th. This formation struck out on the left flank, closest to the Army Group dividing line. With a front of only 20 kilometers, they were densely packed. They advanced, facing little opposition, except for brutal house-to-house fighting in one small village near the border. By 0940, aerial reconnaissance showed unidentified numbers of Red Army soldiers withdrawing to the Neman River in an apparent attempt to rebuild the defensive lines there. The 7th Panzer Division raced to the crossings at the town of Altius. By 1245, the bridges were secured. However, the commander of the Soviet Northwestern Front, Colonel General F.I. Kuznetsov, had other ideas. He sent his 5th Tank Division to throw the panzers back over the Neman. The first to arrive was 44 T-34s, and they faced only 20 German tanks. This should have spelled doom for the advance of the Germans, but the ineptitude of the green Soviet tank crews, as well as the timely arrival of Luftwaffe air support, meant that the T-34s were ravaged in place. They ultimately delayed the advance by only a few hours, but cost the 7th Panzer Division a not insignificant part of its strength. Ultimately, by the end of the day, the 39th Panzer Corps had secured the bridgehead across the Neman and started to build a wedge between the Soviet Northwestern and Western Front commands. This was the prelude for the planned encirclement of the Western Front. The major commanders on both sides recognized this and put their best efforts towards the growing gap. Next in the line was the 9th Army under Colonel General Strauss. His troops were strung along a 200-kilometer front. They crossed the line at 0300 along with the rest of the front. Strauss's main effort was on his left flank, with 3 of his divisions pushing out from Suvlaki and moving towards Grodno. They faced off with the 29th Tank Division of the 3rd Army, who resisted fiercely. There was no easy fighting here. Elements of the 9th Army would be among the first German troops to encounter the KV-1 and the T-34, although only 2 of the heavy and 26 of the medium tanks were present. There is not much information about this encounter, but it appears the tanks were ineffective in their first outing against the Heer. This would not be the case in future encounters. The 9th Army fought their way to the outskirts of Grodno, though they did not take the city until the next day. The Soviet Third Army, under Lieutenant General V. Kuznetsov, was headquartered in the city. Before the day was over, he was in danger of being surrounded. His superiors struggled to understand his situation, which was not uncommon on this day and many days to follow, as German special forces around the area had cut the communication lines. This would plague the Stavka throughout the campaign as they worked to counter the Wehrmacht's moves. By the end of the day, the 9th Army had advanced all along their front, gaining the majority of their first day objectives. On the right flank of Strauss's army was Field Marshal Kluge's 4th Army. With a front of 100 kilometers, they had a large area of responsibility, but still 1/2 the size of the 9th Army's. Unlike many of the other infantry armies, Kluge's assault was preceded by a serious artillery and air bombardment. The army's assault engineers had to push across the Bug River in order to clear the border area and build bridges for the oncoming main body of troops. This went off without a hitch. By 12:30, the first of these were in operation. Crossing the river, the 9th Army began to encounter more serious resistance. This slowed operations somewhat, as German troops were learning, as everywhere this day, that the bypassed Soviets did not surrender automatically. They fought with tenacity even when surrounded, something the Heer had not encountered often in their Western campaigns. Still, the Soviet Western Front, commanded by General of the Army Pavlov, was disintegrating under the pressure of the fighting. By far the biggest issue Pavlov was facing at this point was command and control of his armies. He could not reach the headquarters of several of them, and they could not reliably command their subordinate units. Pavlov had personally petitioned Stalin the day before Operation Barbarossa began for permission to mobilize his forces. He had been summarily denied. That denial cost the Red Army dearly. In no place was this more evident than in the areas in front of Army Group Center. Soviet divisions were scattered, ill-prepared, and often in possession of little more than concepts of a plan to resist an attack. As the first day ended, the 4th Army had advanced an average of 10 to 30 kilometers. The 263rd Infantry Division had made it the furthest on the day, securing the town of Bryansk. Anchoring the right flank of Army Group Center was Colonel General Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group. He had a rather long front of 100 kilometers. However, OKH and Army Group Center had made sure Guderian's panzers were the strongest supported in the entire theatre. The 2nd Panzer Group received the highest priority from Luftwaffe assets and had been assigned the bulk of the Army Group's dedicated formations. As the assault began on the morning of the 22nd of June, the 12th Infantry Corps attacked and surrounded the fortress at Brest. The defensive works were manned by around 9,000 soldiers of various units. They fought tenaciously and refused to surrender. The fortifications would not fall on the first day. On the left flank of the 12th Infantry, there was the 47th Panzer Corps. They had to build pontoon bridges across the Bug in their sector because there were no permanent bridges. This caused a delay in their penetration, but by midday, there were at least 9 bridges in operation. To get some forces across the river immediately, the 18th Panzer Division used 80 specially outfitted Panzer IIIs and IVs to ford the Bug. These proved helpful in defending the still expanding bridgehead, while the engineers worked to build the pontoon bridges. Before noon, the 47th Panzer Corps had crossed the Lesna River, approximately 10 kilometers past the city of Brest-Litovsk. To the right of the 12th Infantry Corps was the 24th Panzer Corps. The main effort of this corps was directed to drive as far as possible in the direction of Minsk, more than 300 kilometers away. Of course, it was not expected that they would reach the city before the end of the first week. It was crucial to get to Minsk as fast as possible in order to effect the first grand encirclement envisioned by Hitler, and no one wanted anything less. Standing in the way was Lieutenant General Korobkov's 4th Army. Late in the day, the 22nd Tank Division was thrown into the fight. German air superiority sealed the fate of the Soviet tank columns. The Wehrmacht's coordination in the field was just too much for the inexperienced and unprepared Red Army. By the end of the first day, the 47th and 24th Panzer Corps had advanced approximately 20 kilometers. This was not the spectacular gains of other areas of the front, but they had faced stiff resistance as well as serious terrain obstacles. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Rundstedt, was divided into 2 halves by the Carpathian Mountains. The southern sector of the Army Group was based along the Prut River in Romania and would not go on the offensive until the 2nd of July. Accordingly, we will not cover the forces there this week. The German 11th Army and the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies remained passive during the first week of Barbarossa. The northern sector had the majority of the army group's combat power. On its northern flank was the 6th Army, commanded by Field Marshal Reichenau. Half of the divisions of the army were assigned to support the 1st Panzer Group under Colonel General Kleist. They moved across the border in sync with the rest of the front and fought through bunkers manned by soldiers of the 15th Rifle Corps. The northernmost 44th Infantry Corps faced extremely stiff resistance. Before the day was out, they would endure hundreds of casualties and only advance an average of 15 kilometers. The 17th Infantry Corps manned the southern portion of the front. These soldiers faced some resistance, but initially it was not nearly as stiff as that of the 44th Infantry. That changed before midday, as the men of the 15th Rifle Corps fought desperately to keep their bunkers. Even after many of the bunkers were thought to have been cleared, Soviet soldiers managed to keep fighting. This would continue until the day was over. Nevertheless, elements of the 6th Army had made it 15 kilometers over the border in some areas. The 1st Panzer Group's supporting infantry battered away at the Soviet bunkers all along the Bug. Once there was a small gap opened around noon, Kleist's panzers roared to life and began their assault. They were held up by bunkers that had been accidentally bypassed by the infantry ahead. This fighting ensured that only one of the 5 panzer divisions of the 1st Panzer Group made it across the border on the first day. This was the 11th Panzer Division, commanded by Major General Kruvel. This division didn't make it far, only 25 kilometers, but it was a relatively strong gain for the south on the first day. The Red Army was not ready for the attack anywhere along the front, but along the Bug River they were at least able to resist from prepared defensive positions. The Soviet armies defending the region had more tanks than anywhere else, and though they were employed incompetently, they managed to score some hits on the invaders. They would continue to do so in the coming days. The first day of Operation Barbarossa was a definite success. Many of the goals for the first day had been exceeded. Prior to the opening moves that morning, many of the Wehrmacht's leaders stressed that strategic surprise was possible, but tactical surprise was unlikely. By the end of the first day, these concerns had proven to be baseless. Complete tactical and strategic surprise had been achieved on a scale that seemed to be the stuff of fantasy just weeks ago. This was the latest of a string of incredible successes that built the legend of the Wehrmacht. Poland, then France and the Low Countries, and now the Soviet Union. This success was intoxicating to many of the highest leaders, especially Hitler. They allowed themselves the release of unbridled optimism for the coming days of Operation Barbarossa. It appeared as if another of Hitler's daring gambles had paid off. However, there was a darker side to the first day. Underneath the victories of the opening hours, the average soldier was learning that the Red Army was not filled with conscripted Untermensch with no will to fight. Instead, they faced determined and wily professional soldiers who displayed incredible courage in the face of overwhelming odds. To further complicate the narrative of victory, while the generals of the Wehrmacht were already weaving in their command posts, logistics were already proving an issue. Some of Hoth's panzers had run out of fuel in the fighting, and Kluge's men had discovered that the roads of the Soviet Union were not those of France. Throughout Army Group Center, units were discovering that what had been marked as proper roads on their maps were little more than sandy trails cut through dense forests. This meant that trucks often got stuck, requiring man and horse to pull them through. Tanks consumed significantly more fuel on these tracks. Almost nowhere would the roads allow for two-way traffic, complicating routing of men and material. To many of the junior officers and soldiers doing the fighting, it was clear that there would be no easy days on the Eastern Front. Stalin and his command staff were taken aback at the swiftness and brutality of the German invasion. There had been rumors swirling in the capital for days, if not weeks. Stalin himself had personally ordered that his men not mobilize mere hours before the kickoff of the German assault. At the time, he feared provoking Hitler. Perhaps reminiscing on September 1939, he was hoping that a last-minute deal could be struck. He was wrong. Hitler was set on his invasion as a matter of ideologically rooted necessity. This madness drove him to begin the largest military campaign in history, but one doomed to fail. Over the first few hours of the invasion, Stalin's high command resolved to resist. They would not allow the Red Army to collapse without a fight. The generals, led by Marshal Timoshenko, began issuing orders for immediate counterattacks while planning larger counteroffensives for the coming days. Each of the German army groups was supported at the operational level by an air corps, with Army Groups Center and South each having 2 air corps. Army Group North was supported by the 1st Air Corps under the 1st Air Fleet. The corps lacked the dedicated ground attack U-87 Stuka wings present in other air corps, but made up for it with the heaviest concentration of U-88 medium bombers. In addition to the 1st Air Corps forces, there was also an ad hoc organization under Lieutenant Colonel von Wild that was intended to screen the coast and ensure that the Soviet Navy did not attempt to interfere with the movement of the Heer along the coast. As happened all along the front, the 1st Air Corps struck Soviet air bases in its sector with surprise and vicious thoroughness. There was only meager Soviet resistance. The Red Air Force was hampered by a significant lack of modern equipment, poor command and control, and by the total surprise of being attacked without any warning. The few fighters that managed to get into the air were completely outclassed by their German counterparts. Soviet losses in the first days of the war were so severe that even the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe found them hard to believe. There were an estimated 1,800 Soviet planes destroyed on the first day, and hundreds more throughout the week. In the far north, the war opened with a massive Soviet bomber raid on the 25th of June. The raid targeted cities across Finland with approximately 500 medium bombers. This was a critical demonstration of continuing strength for the Red Air Force. The Luftwaffe could not stop them all, and the Finnish Air Force was not in a significantly better position. The ultimate result was that Finland officially joined the war. This would prove to be a short-term boon for the Nazi war effort. Down in the mud, the Heer was advancing steadily northward, even in the face of stiff Red Army resistance. Along the coast, the 291st Infantry had made a near miraculous advance, making it to Latvia. They were promptly ordered to moderate their advance in the face of resistance in the centre, and the slower progress of the rest of the 18th Army on their right. The corps of the 18th Army were making decent progress. The 26th Infantry Corps was pushing through light resistance as they marched to try to secure the crossroads at Šiauliai. The swampy terrain hindered marching, as the 10th Rifle Division fought to keep them back. This was a futile effort. The Soviets were not only caught by surprise, but outnumbered, outflanked, and outmaneuvered. The 30th Infantry Corps on the right faced even rougher terrain than that of its brethren in the 26th. Resistance was also light, however, as only the 90th Rifle Division stood in its way to Šiauliai. Höppner's two Panzer Corps faced remarkably different levels of opposition from Red Army forces in the area. Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps raced past Ariogola and along the One Good Road to Daugavpils. Securing the crossings of the Dvina at this juncture was crucial to the future advance of the army group. Manstein reached the city on the 26th of June. His advance of over 300 kilometers was a feat in and of itself, but it had isolated his corps from his neighbors to the right and left. For the next 3 days, his men held on to the bridgehead in the face of serious counterattacks by the Soviet 27th Army. Sometime on the 29th, infantry support from the 16th Army started to arrive. This should have been the cue for Manstein to lurch forward again, but orders arrived from Höppner that Army Group North had halted the panzers on the Dvina until the infantry could catch up across the line. Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps had made several small tactical blunders on the first day. These resulted in losing the initiative to the Soviet 8th Army and its parent Northwestern Front. While Manstein was racing to the Dvina, the 41st Panzer Corps was facing the brunt of the Red Army's counterattacks in the region. The Soviet 8th Army had placed its reserves over 100 kilometers from the border. This decision carried with it major consequences. On the one hand, Army headquarters was unable to move its reserves up to help the frontline divisions. This doomed the 10th and 90th Rifles to fighting a hopeless retreat without the support of the armor. On the other, it meant the bulk of the army was not immediately encircled in the first days of fighting. This breathing space meant that a counterattack was able to be organized. As commander of the Northwestern Front, F.I. Kuznetsov had ordered the counterattack. He dispatched orders to the 27th and 8th Armies to begin the preparations within hours of the opening of hostilities. However, his ability to send orders was severely hindered as command bunkers were destroyed, phone and power lines were inoperative, and many officers were not in control of their units. To make matters more complicated, the speed of the Wehrmacht's advance in some sectors was making orders obsolete before they even arrived. Kuznetsov ordered the 8th Army to get its armor into action. Lieutenant General Subininkov organized his mechanized corps for the assault. The 12th Mechanized would push from the north, attacking the 41st Panzer Corps at Titivenai. In the south, the Soviet 11th Army's 3rd Mechanized attacked from north of Kaunas in the direction of Raseiniai. Together, the two corps mustered around 350 tanks. The two panzer divisions of the 41st Corps were in possession of approximately 390 tanks. Finally, after long delays, during the night of the 22nd, the tanks were concentrating and prepared for their counterattack against Reinhardt's Panzer Corps. This concentration was diluted by orders from the Soviet 8th Army. drawing away one of the tank divisions to counterattack at the border. This unauthorized diversion demonstrated just how tenuous the lines of communication between various levels of the Red Army's hierarchy was. Confusion abounded. The counterattack was a messy, ill-coordinated affair from the beginning. Besides the command and control issues, logistics were problematic. The 12th Mechanized Corps did not have enough fuel on hand for the road march to the assembly area, a distance of around 60 kilometers. Major General Shestopalov attempted to get supply convoys to fetch fuel during the night of the 22nd into the 23rd, but this proved a nearly impossible task. The roads were overcrowded, and continuing confusion about which units were where aggravated the situation. Dawn on the 23rd saw harassing Luftwaffe attacks that further disrupted the Corps' road march and supply efforts. It was not until the following afternoon that one of his divisions made it to the jumping-off point for the counterattack. This was the 28th Tank Division, which had only light tanks. There were 230 tanks in the division, however, and this could have been a powerful attacking force if properly supported. This was not to be. Colonel Chernyakhovsky, the commander of the division, ordered an assault by the 1st Regiment on the scene. The 55th Tank Regiment attacked with only 40 light tanks. They pushed into the 21st Infantry Division, who was able to repulse them with anti-tank and artillery fire. This piecemeal assault started at 2100. After only 3 hours, Chernyakhovsky called off the assault. It cost him 17 of his 40 tanks. Nothing of consequence was gained. Near Iceni, things were calm for the moment. The 6th Panzer Division was refueling and rearming. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had located a column of Soviet armor on the road from Kidani, but this report was lost somewhere along the way. On the morning of the 24th, the division was struck by the 2nd Tank Division of the 3rd Mechanized Corps. The morning brought two new realities to the men of the 6th Panzer. Not only were they caught off guard by the Soviet counterattack, but the 2nd Tank Division was manned mostly with the best medium and heavy tanks in the Red Army. Hitherto unknown to the Wehrmacht, T-34s, KV-1s, and the monstrous KV-2 roared into battle. The shock of seeing the large tanks was amplified by the complete ineffectiveness of the division's anti-tank weapons against them. Round after round bounced off the thick armor of the Red tanks. The Pak-36 was worse than useless against these tanks. Its 37mm shell was essentially obsolete by 1941, being replaced by the larger and more capable 50mm Pak-38. However, even the larger Pak-38 could not deal with the frontal armor of the Soviet tanks. Eventually, 3 KV-2s broke through the division's front, overrunning the infantry. This was the first time German infantry underwent the terrifying ordeal of being overrun by tanks, something the French and British had experienced many times in the Western theatre. The breakthrough shocked German commanders. It was only the 3rd day of the war. They were supposed to be crushing a surprised Red Army with obsolete equipment and intellectually stunted leadership. Instead, they were the ones confronted with the inadequacy of their equipment and the inability of their reconnaissance to inform them of a pending attack, with leaders stunned by the course of events. A wake-up call for many soldiers and officers, to be sure. The KV-2s attacked the division reserve as they crossed the Debisa River. After more intense fighting, the tanks began to overrun a field howitzer battery. Quick-thinking soldiers began to direct fire the 150mm guns at point-blank range at the oncoming KV-2s. Still, the heavy tanks shrugged off the attacks. It was not until the howitzer fire physically destroyed the tracks of the tanks that the tanks were put out of action. The heavy tanks were immobilized, but the threat would persist until German infantry dealt with the tanks the hard way, by hand. This singular breakthrough did not change the outcome of the battle. The Soviet tanks were still too disorganized. They were manned by poorly trained crews that in some cases did not know how to operate the vehicle fully, much less work together in small unit tactics. The 2nd Tank Division's attack sputtered out as the piecemeal attacks ran out of fuel and ammunition. The fighting was not over yet. Reinhardt was maneuvering his 1st Panzer and elements of the 36th Infantry Divisions around the open flank of the 2nd Tank Division. Meanwhile, Manstein's panzers had reached Kidani in the rear of the Soviets. By the night of the 24th, Solyankin had been surrounded. He would not give up. On the morning of the 25th, he attempted a breakout with his remaining tanks. This was shut down, but not without more drama, as the KV tanks attacked and nearly broke through the German lines. However, the soldiers on the ground were learning the value of their anti-aircraft guns in defeating the heavy tanks. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun would go on to become legendary in this new role, but these were the earliest days in this type of employment. it was not without its failures, and this particular use of it was born of desperation. Everything else had been tried, and barring isolated instances, like howitzers destroying tracks, everything else had failed. The 2nd Tank Division would hold out until sometime on the 26th, when Solyankin was killed. Reinhardt's corps was able to move on shortly after, though it is likely there was sporadic fighting in isolated pockets even after the Heer had decided the battle was over. By June 26th, both of the Northwestern Front's counterstrokes had failed. The northern sector of this front was shattered, and Army Group North was taking full advantage of the situation. The Red Army retreated in complete disorder. Any division that was not broken or surrounded in the first days was so worn out as to be combat ineffective. Kuznetsov was receiving orders from the Stavka in Moscow to continue counterattacking, to drive northwest from Kaunas and cut off the advancing panzers. This was an impossibility, not least because Kaunas had fallen on the 24th. There, the Soviet 11th Army had struggled to hold the line in the face of the assault by the 2nd Infantry Corps. The other tank division of the 3rd Mechanized Corps was sent to the front around Kaunas to try to repair the holes in the lines. This was fundamentally a flawed approach, as had already been demonstrated in the north by the 12th Mechanized Corps. Piecemeal assaults by isolated tanks were of no use in making meaningful progress against the German army. Still, the division was sent to the front. They were promptly overrun and sent reeling in the direction of Vilnius. A dangerous gap had been opened with this retreat. The northwestern front was being cleaved in two by the advance of Manstein and the resulting retreats in the face of the other elements of Army Group North. After defeating the simultaneous attacks at Rysenai and Titivenai, Reinhardt's corps pushed past the flank of the retreating 8th Army and into position alongside the 56th Panzer Corps. They arrived on the Dvina River at Yerkeblis, about 90 kilometers to the north of Daugavpils. It is unclear exactly when they arrived in force, but it was on or before the 30th of June. Army Group North's orders to halt at the Dvina applied to Reinhardt's panzers as well. The panzer commanders fiercely protested this frustrating halt, but the Field Marshal held his ground. He estimated that the strategic situation was not as clear as he wanted, and he felt his lengthening right flank was a vulnerability that needed to be addressed. After all, the Soviet forces there had not been encircled, but had retreated, posing a threat from Vilnius, even in their weakened state. Busch's 16th Army was still fighting and marching its way to the Dvina. They had the longest and most arduous route of the army group, and it showed in their advance. The 18th Army was advancing rapidly through Latvia and was only a few kilometers from Riga. The Soviet situation was grim. The northwestern front was now divided into two unequal halves, with few prepared defences available to the remaining forces. The tank divisions had been decimated, and the logistics arm of the armies had been thrashed by the Luftwaffe and the dysfunctional front line's rapidly changing character. Kuznetsov was facing serious pressure from Stavka to repair the situation. Partially because of their own poor understanding of the situation on the ground, they continued to order massive counterattacks that were not possible. They did not know that some of the units they were ordering had ceased to exist. The first week of the war started with disaster, and the situation did not improve. Despite many examples of personal bravery, determined resistance, and the battle testing of the Red Army's superior tanks, the Northwestern Front had been thrown back from its prepared defences, was in open retreat, and was unable to keep a coherent line of defence. Einsatzgruppen men marched into Kaunas alongside the German army on June 24th. Almost immediately, a pogrom was initiated by the Einsatzgruppen. Most of the killing in the first days was conducted by locals who were sanctioned by the Nazis. The organized murder would begin within days of the occupation and would not halt for years. Two air corps supported Army Group Center. This dedication of air units reflected the status the Army Group had as the main effort of Operation Barbarossa. Around 1,500 planes were committed under the auspices of the 2nd Air Fleet. Both air corps were in possession of a strong mixed force of modern light bombers, dive bombers and fighters. During the first week, they conducted raids on Soviet airfields and supply dumps, and attempted to disrupt the Red Army's response to the invasion. By the end of the week, there was little dispute that the Luftwaffe had won the opening phase of the air war. However, the problems were beginning to present themselves even in this early phase. As large as the air commitment was, there was never enough close air support available for the front lines. Gaps in air reconnaissance were beginning to become a problem. This allowed Soviet concentrations to go unnoticed, resulting in missed opportunities, surprise counterattacks, and an incomplete tactical picture for the Corps and Army commanders. On the other hand, there were notable successes for the close air support arm of the air fleet, as we shall see. The left flank of Army Group Center was anchored by the 6th Corps in the Suwałki salient. These men struck out in a northwestern direction towards Vilnius. Together with the panzers of the 3rd Panzer Group, they needed to secure the bridges at Alytus on the Niemen River. There were several Red Army divisions in the area. The Soviet 11th Army was spread thinly across a front of 170 kilometers. Little resistance was mustered in front of the Niemen to the advance of the panzers. Alytus was captured on the 22nd of June. Colonel General Hott was in charge of the 3rd Panzer Group, and he drove his Panzer Corps hard. They made the distance of 65 kilometers from the start point to the bridges at Alytus in less than 10 hours. They started crossing the Niemen almost immediately, after brushing aside a small NKVD border guard post on the town's outskirts. The 11th Army was under the command of the Soviet Northwestern Front, which had already started to organize its counterattack against the 4th Panzer Group around Rosynia. Consequently, the 11th Army had only the 5th Tank Division to counter the crossing at Alytus. To make matters worse, the Soviet tanks had to road march 30 kilometers to get into position. This delay gave the panzers time to concentrate, getting an entire regiment in place to cross the Niemen. Several of the Soviet tanks fell out on the road due to mechanical issues. They arrived in force with 44 T-34s. The panzer troops were caught off guard in this first encounter with the new tank. The Soviet tanks immediately shut down the northern of the two bridges, destroying a Panzer 38T on sight. However, the T-34s had little armor-piercing ammunition and pulled back to a defilade position in order to minimize exposure while still covering the bridge. The German commander on the scene, Colonel Rottenberg, called in Luftwaffe support. This arrived shortly, dropping high explosives in and around the Soviet positions in the northern area. Just before this, the T-34s were reinforced by more T-28 medium tanks. Together, they held the Germans just out of range of the Panzer's light armament. As this action at the northern bridge was playing out, more panzers started across the southern bridge. They were met by BT-7 tanks. A minor stalemate ensued in both sectors, but the Soviets lacked the staying power of their German counterparts. As evening came, the Soviet failure to properly support their tanks with infantry, artillery and air support was apparent. The Germans finally were able to break through and continued the drive. The Soviet 5th Tank Division fell back the next morning, having lost approximately 70 tanks. This included at least 27 of the modern T-34s that were in short supply in the earliest days of the war. Many of these tanks had been lost to operator error. 2 of them had been driven into the river by accident, resulting in total losses. The Germans lost maybe as much as 30 tanks, but only about 11 of these were total losses. All of the Soviet losses were irrecoverable. This difference was due to several factors, but perhaps most obvious was the fact that as the Soviets retreated, they often did so in disarray. Even had they been more organized, it is unclear how well equipped the tank divisions were with recovery equipment. At least in the first weeks of the war, the Germans outperformed the Soviets in this essential task. To the south of the Alytus area was the Białystok salient. This was a broad protrusion of the Soviet lines into German-controlled Poland. It was hemmed in on the northern and southern flanks by German forces. At its broadest point, it was approximately 250 kilometers wide. The fortress of Brest anchored the south portion of the front, along the Bug River. The dividing line between the Soviets' northwestern and western fronts was along the line just south of Alytus. This gave Hott's panzers a distinct advantage, as they were cleaving along a divided area of responsibility. The opposing western front had the majority of its forces inside the Białystok salient. The first day saw the commander of the western front, General Pavlov, struggling to fight back and maintain his lines. Distracted by the enormity of this task, he was unable to devote significant forces to secure his northern flank. Unfortunately for him, this meant that Hott's panzers were able to begin a massive encirclement from the north. On the 25th of June, elements of the 57th Panzer Corps captured Vilnius. The 39th Panzer Corps started pushing towards Minsk. They drove in a swinging motion behind the Soviet Third Army, trapping them in the first outlines of what would become the Białystok-Minsk Encirclement. During the afternoon of the 22nd, German assault guns under the 8th Infantry Division took Grodno. During their approach, they bumped into the 29th Tank Division. Unfortunately for the Red Army, the local commander, Colonel Studnev, was not among its best and brightest stars. He mistook the assault guns for panzers and decided to engage from a distance. His poorly trained gunners wasted their ammunition loads with poor shooting. The Germans, realizing that their assault guns were unlikely to be effective, hunkered down and called in close air support. The U-87 Stuka dive bombers swiftly arrived and engaged the stationary Soviet tanks. The 8th Infantry Division also engaged with their artillery, which was effective in destroying several light tanks. All told, Stutnev's men endured the combined arms assault for 4 hours before retreating. The 29th Tank Division had lost 33 tanks and only managed to cause maybe a couple of dozen casualties to the invaders. The delay wasn't significant because the panzers were never even present in the area. They were busy pushing east and north as fast as possible. They needed to envelop the very units that were so willingly obliging them by rushing to the border inside of the growing pocket. On the southern half of the developing encirclement was the 2nd Panzer Group, under Colonel General Guderian. His group was the largest concentration of armoured forces yet gathered in the short history of the Wehrmacht. To correspond with this, for the first stages of Operation Barbarossa, his Panzer Group was assigned one of the longest marches to its objective, Minsk, over 400 kilometers from his starting point. The 3rd Panzer Group's march was comparatively short, at only 300 kilometers. Additionally, it was expected that some of the stiffest enemy resistance would be on Guderian's march line. The first week started with mixed results. The Brest fortress could not be overwhelmed and had to be bypassed. The infantry of Field Marshal Kluge's 4th Army would be tasked with its reduction instead. Guderian's tanks had to deal with Red Army tank units as soon as they began crossing the Bug on the morning of the 22nd. The 14th Mechanized Corps counterattacked en masse with over 200 tanks. However, these were almost entirely the nearly obsolete light tanks of the last decade. The newer and more advanced tanks that were giving other panzer units so much trouble in other places along the front were not present in front of Guderian at the moment. Several factors combined to give the panzers the edge. They had tactical surprise, better organization, and ready close air support, to name a few. The counterattack was stopped in its tracks with severe Soviet losses. The Germans were down a few tanks, but the counterattack had not seriously hindered their progress. During the next days, Marshal Timoshenko, in his role as commander of the entire field army, tried to prod the Western Front into using its armor to counter the invading forces. He directed several armored units to retake Grodno, still not understanding that there were no panzer units present in the city. The 6th Mechanized Corps was ordered to march to the city and expel the Germans. The massive Luftwaffe dedication to Army Group Center paid off again, as aerial reconnaissance detected the tank columns approaching on the 23rd. This detection was relayed to the 8th Flying Corps headquarters, who then sent aircraft to attack the columns. Colonel General Richthoven's planes destroyed 63 tanks, wreaking havoc on the road march. Still, when the 6th Mechanized arrived on the scene in the Grodno area, it was a formidable force. On paper, it was the strongest collection of armor in the Red Army. In his corps, Major General Hadskilevich had at least 100 KV tanks and close to 200 T-34s, as well as hundreds of light tanks. There were issues with this concentration, one of which was that his light tanks used gasoline, and his medium and heavy tanks used diesel. This meant that in the best-case scenario, his logistics apparatus would need to deliver 2 types of fuel, and that these stocks would deplete at uneven rates. Unfortunately for Hadskilevich, the closest major supply depot at Bialystok had been destroyed, and his next source was at Verkhovsk, 75 kilometers to his rear. He sent what he could back to retrieve more fuel supplies, but for the moment, the 6th Mechanized Corps would be hampered by the shortage. It was impossible to coordinate any action with the 11th Mechanized Corps due to a lack of radios or other communication equipment. Accordingly, as the previously mentioned mauling of the 29th Tank Division was happening, Hadskilevich was not in a position to assist. Only on the 24th did he move to assault. He could only use his light tanks because of the continuing diesel shortage, and these were poorly positioned, running right into prepared anti-tank defenses. These were repulsed. On the 25th, he tried again, this time with his medium and heavy tanks in the mix. Still, there was little success. There was essentially little to no combination of the artillery, infantry and air support with the tanks in the manner demonstrated by the Germans time and time again in the first days. Consequently, any localized moments of success were crushed by the Wehrmacht's combined arms team as the hapless Soviet tanks attacked in waves of increasing desperation. Only the Soviet heavy tanks proved to be too much for the Germans to handle, but even these were hampered by inept crews and poor coordination. Eventually they were abandoned or taken down with close-range heavy anti-tank fire. Only in the late afternoon did Western Front headquarters realize they were squandering their armor. The Heer had not centered their armor at Grodno, but on the flanks of the salient. In horror, Pavlov realized it too late. He ordered the remnants of the 6th and 11th Mechanized Corps to pull back and cover Slonim to prevent Guderian from cutting his main line of retreat. This did not go well. The retreat essentially broke the units, and they became little more than a disorganized mob. The 17th Panzer Division arrived at Slonim late in the day on the 24th. There they found the bridge blown. They managed to get pioneers to build a bridge across the Shara River that night. The rest of the 47th Panzer Corps caught up and fought through to Baranovichi. The Bialystok pocket was now all but closed. The panzers of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoch's 3rd still had to get to Minsk, but there was little in their way. The 12th and 20th Panzer Divisions made it to the outskirts of the city sometime on the 26th of June. They began their assault the next day. The city was surrounded by a ring of bunkers and other fortifications, but these were not manned by the full strength necessary for a proper defense. The city was the easternmost point of an encirclement that had trapped the better part of 3 Soviet armies inside. The 3rd, 10th and 13th armies were loosely arranged in an oval stretching from Novokhrudsk in the west to Minsk in the east. The last major independent unit of the Western Front was the 4th Army, under Major General Korobkov. He only escaped encirclement with his comrades in front of Minsk because Guderian's panzers had cleaved him from them south of Baranovichi. His 4th Army lived to fight another day, but they lost significant strength inside of the pocket. As Hoch's panzers assaulted the city, the fortifications continued to hold them back, causing casualties. There was also the mud, the result of recent rain. This limited their maneuverability as they fought through and around the outskirts of Minsk. Guderian's leading elements were still a long way off from being able to seal the southern flanks of the encirclement. The Luftwaffe was hammering the city with bombs. These often caused fires when they exploded. At one point, something like half of Minsk was experiencing active fires. This only made the defense of the city that much harder. Finally, on June 28th, the heart of Minsk was occupied by elements of the 12th Panzer Division. Guderian still could not close his end of the encirclement. It wasn't until well after Minsk fell that his men linked up with Hoch's. Sometime on June 29th, the encirclement had been sealed. However, this was just enough time for several units of the 13th Army to filter through the gap. The infantry armies of Army Group Center made their way up and began reducing the pocket. This was not an easy feat. Even when Red Army units surrendered, the sheer size of the pocket was hard to manage. Many soldiers would fight and die long after the Wehrmacht's generals had reported the issue moot. The pocket would not be declared liquidated for several days yet. Fighting was severe until the very end. This battle became known as the Bialystok-Minsk Pocket. It was the first major operational success of Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest encirclements in modern military history, rivaled only by the Dunkirk Pocket. The vast majority of the Western Front was destroyed, encircled, or disintegrating in retreat away from the advancing Germans. In the aftermath of the sealing of the encirclement, Hitler intervened in the chain of command and ordered the panzers to halt. He had done something very similar in the lead-up to Dunkirk, and for many of the same reasons. He was fearful of the panzers leaving the infantry behind, exposing their long and fragile logistical apparatus to counterattack. Colonel General Halder argued against this in his role of Chief of Staff of the OKH. Nominally, he was the man to make such decisions, and in wars past he would have. However, Halder underestimated Hitler's willpower in this matter, something he would continue to do for the rest of his tenure. The panzers were halted over his objections. The Soviet leadership was distraught, but determined to continue the fight. Much of the Nazi leadership was sure the Soviet Union could not resist such a blow as they had delivered at Minsk. They had delivered the kick in the door, and now expected the whole rotten structure to come crumbling down. They were mistaken. Stalin would not allow the Soviet Union to fall so easily. Timoshenko was put in charge of the Western Front in Pavlov's place, and he set about organizing his defense in front of Smolensk. The enemy's objective was now clear. The panzers would continue on the Brest-Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow route. It was Timoshenko's objective to halt them. Army Group South was supported by the 4th Air Fleet, with 2 air corps, the 4th and 5th. The air fleet had approximately 392 light bombers and 248 fighters. Notable in this mix was that there were U-87 Stukas assigned to the air fleet. These were the workhorses of close air support in the Luftwaffe, but they were never enough. There was also the issue of the distances involved in this area, which precluded significant use of the Stukas due to their limited range. The He-111 had almost double the range of the smaller Stuka, but was less agile and harder to use in the type of close-in precision work required in close air support missions. The bombers of the 4th Air Fleet conducted much of the same first-day missions of other air fleets, bombing airfields, command centers and supply dumps. As the week progressed, they continued to establish air superiority, bordering on air supremacy. Army Group South was divided into not quite equal halves. The southern half of the Army Group in Romania would not begin serious operations until the first week of July. However, they did seize bridges across the Prut River with patrol-sized elements in the first week. These were held in order to secure a path for the German 11th Army and the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies to move into Bessarabia and southern Ukraine when the time came. No serious resistance was encountered, perhaps because the Soviet attention was so focused on where the invasion was happening at the moment. It was not until June 25th that the Soviet Southern Front was activated in order to defend Odessa and the southern approaches to the Ukrainian steppe. This activation, while late, placed the Red Army in the region on a much better footing when the Germans and Romanians did move across the border in force in early July. The Soviet Southwestern Front, under Lieutenant General Kipanos, was the largest and best prepared of the Soviet fronts along the border. He had done well to ensure that serious fortifications had been built along the Ukrainian border. There was also a well-organized system of communication that gave Kipanos a warning that his comrades to the north did not receive. This warning was not in advance of the invasion itself, instead consisting of affirmative information that the invasion was indeed happening earlier than other front commanders had. Kipanos was able to start organizing his men and planning counterattacks within minutes instead of hours. The Southwestern Front had 4,780 tanks, arranged in 8 mechanized corps. The 1st Panzer Group under Colonel General Kleist had only 715 tanks. However, this seemingly overwhelming superiority in numbers was watered down by the dispersion of the Soviet mechanized corps, as well as the lack of communication equipment, training, and effective tactics. These limitations aside, Kleist still faced a deadly enemy that he knew he could not dismiss out of hand. As he broke through into the open country in the first days of the war, he had to face counterattacks from every direction, sometimes simultaneously. He worked to use his panzers effectively and skillfully handled the situations as they came. The battles ahead would not be straightforward. In the first hours of the invasion, the German 6th Army tried to force a bridgehead across the Bug River. Opposing them were 2 rifle divisions, the 124th and the 140th. The Soviets were too spread out to resist the Germans, and within hours, most of the infantry was flowing across the river. They ran into a series of prepared defensive positions. The 4th and 2nd fortified regions covered the major crossings in front of the river. It took all day for the infantry of the 6th Army to grind through these positions, enduring grueling bunker-to-bunker combat. This gave the Southwest Front precious time to react, even though the panzers had broken out by midday. They would continue to move forward in the next week, fighting through stiff opposition for days, only to march seemingly impossible distances to catch up to panzers, fend off Red Army counterattacks, rinse and repeat. The infantry was learning just what kind of war they were in for. The first week was hard, and it would never get easier. Kipanos received orders from Moscow late on the night of the 22nd. This was Directive No. 3, from the desk of Marshal Timoshenko. Directive No. 3 was a call for a general counteroffensive. This was completely detached from reality, but it was rooted in the pre-war plans of the Red Army. It called for Kipanos to use his overwhelming superiority in armor to strike across the southern lines of the German thrust, cutting them off from their bases in Poland. However, this plan was founded on 2 things. The first was that the Red Army needed a chance to mobilize their forces in order to be able to pull off the intended counterstroke. June 22nd found them almost completely flat-footed, with troops dispersed across the operational area. There was no time for mobilizing and organizing. Divisions and corps were force-marched to jumping-off points with little to no preparation. The second missing element for the Red Army to manage an effective counteroffensive was a clear strategic conception of where the main effort was. The Red Army was still struggling to comprehend the vastness of the attack, which exceeded anything they had prepared for. The entirety of the Western Soviet border was under attack. There was little room for maneuver under these conditions. The lines of communication between units and commanders were severed. Generals did not know where units were, much less how they were faring under the onslaught of the German invasion. These were the conditions that the front commanders were facing when Timoshenko and the General Staff ordered the counteroffensive. Kirponos was supposed to be the main effort. Under no illusions of his capacity to push the Germans back, he found himself with no choice: follow orders and organize the counterattack, or be recalled to Moscow. In the wake of the purge, the threat was implicit in the order. In order to facilitate the order for the counteroffensive, Timoshenko sent general staff officers to each of the fronts. Army General Zhukov was sent to aid Kirponos. Unfortunately for the counteroffensive, Kirponos was still trying to concentrate his forces when the order went out. This meant that the mechanized corps, which were supposed to be the main effort, had to be committed to action piecemeal. Few of the corps were even able to get into battle as a whole unit. This was the opposite of what Timoshenko had envisaged, but there was little Kirponos could do. Delaying the offensive was out of the question. He ordered his armor forward. The 22nd and 15th Mechanized Corps were to attack the northern and southern flanks of the German penetration. By chance, on the morning of the invasion, the 22nd Mechanized Corps' strongest unit was training just north of Vladimir Volinsky. The 41st Tank Division under Colonel P. Pavlov had 31 KV series tanks and nearly 350 T-34s. He was in an excellent position to strike at the growing penetration. However, his pre-war orders were to pull back to his assembly area in the event of an invasion. Pavlov compromised with local commanders who were begging him to assist. He sent a single tank battalion of his lightest tanks to the front. He pulled the rest of the division back to Kovel. The T-26 battalion was slaughtered by German anti-tank elements at Vladimir Volinsky. The commander of the battalion, Major Suyin, arrived with 50 tanks and promptly had 30 of them destroyed. The Soviets were forced to abandon the town. Kirponos had 48 hours to begin his counteroffensive with the scattered mechanized corps at his disposal. Kleist had divided his panzers into two spearheads, one driving in the north to Lutsk and one in the south that would sweep through and secure Berestechko. As Kirponos tried to concentrate his forces, Kleist's spearheads continued driving. In the south, the advance was led by General of Panzers Kruve and his 11th Panzer Division. When they got to Redikov, nearly 70 kilometers into the country, it was near midday of the 23rd. They ran into the 10th Tank Division. At first, they were able to push out the surprised Soviet tankers. After this coup, Kruve pushed up his men in force and built a defensive ring in anticipation of a counterattack. Predicting the need for heavier anti-tank work, he made sure the Luftwaffe's 88mm were brought up and in place. By the time Major General Ogutsov was able to get his tanks into position to retake the town, the 11th Panzer Division was sitting in strongly prepared positions. Ogutsov obliged his enemies by attacking in waves. This senseless tactic allowed the defenders the privilege of never facing the entire force of his division. He pulled back after losing 46 tanks at the cost of 5 panzers and a few anti-tank guns. Kirponos was aware of the attack and tried to direct more of his forces to the battle, which was rapidly expanding as the 11th Panzer sent a battalion to secure Berestechko. In the north, General of Panzers Kuhn was leading his 14th Panzer Division to Lutsk. Together, the 11th and 14th Panzer formed the spearheads of Kleist's advance into Ukraine. The Southwestern Front's nominal superiority of armor was melting away in the face of reality. Unfortunately, the circumstances meant Kirponos had to direct his armor as they arrived on the scene. This meant piecemeal attacks that could be handled in turn by Kleist. Throughout the fighting of the first few days, he wisely kept a strong reserve force. This allowed him to use them as a mobile fire brigade, plugging gaps and beating back dangerous Red Army attacks as they happened. The piecemeal nature of the attacks meant that he was never unduly pressured in the endeavor to maintain his lines and continue to push them bit by bit eastward. On the morning of the 24th, the Southwestern Front's counteroffensive still had not materialized. The 14th Panzer Division was pushing on Lutsk and stumbled into the 5th Army's 1st Anti-Tank Brigade. The Soviets were still road marching, and the Panzers got the jump on them. Their commander soon had his guns unlimbered and online, and they started firing. The fighting was intense, but the Soviets lacked any supporting arms. This shortcoming led to a familiar story. The Red Army was fighting bravely, but it could not manage to coordinate its resources at the point of decision. The Germans were experts in just this sort of thing. The Wehrmacht consistently managed to create and exploit local advantages that led to larger successes. At 1400, the 22nd Mechanized Corps was in position to attack the 14th Panzer, but only with its 19th Tank Division. This went predictably poorly. The light Soviet tanks were shredded by German combined arms. By 1800 on the 24th, the Soviets were in retreat behind Lutsk. German artillery wreaked havoc on the retreating units, killing the 22nd Mechanized Corps' commander in the process. In the south, near Lviv, the 17th Army was pushing ever closer. The Soviet 6th Army commander, Lieutenant General Muzichenko, directed his 4th Mechanized Corps to counterattack. Unfortunately, Muzichenko marched and countermarched his tanks up and down the front line, using them to attack piecemeal, without support, in an effort to shore up his lines. This led to a near destruction of the combat power of the Corps, with many tanks lost to enemy action and even more to mechanical fallouts on the roads. The 25th saw more Red Army failures. Dubno fell to the Germans, as did Lutsk. The 15th Mechanized Corps, under Major General Karpieza, could not be motivated to attack the exposed flanks of the 11th Panzer Division. Karpieza baffled his superiors. The normally strict Red Army command structure was unable to get this man to attack. This was an unusual failure for a commander of Zhukov's caliber. He had the entire weight of the establishment behind him, yet Karpieza stayed in command and continued to defy expectations and orders from above. Finally, on the 25th, Zhukov and Kirpenos had assembled their forces, albeit weakened, for the planned counterstroke. It had taken 3 days, but the forces were in place. On the south side of the growing bulge were the 15th Mechanized Corps and the newly arrived 8th Mechanized Corps. In the north, the 9th and 19th Mechanized Corps were in place at Rovno. The fighting started in the north, with the 9th Mechanized making a small attack, and then retreating to a defensive posture. The 19th Mechanized went all in, and was mauled at Dubno. The southern attack fared little better than its northern counterpart. The 15th Mechanized stayed put, allowing the 8th Mechanized the opportunity to push the Germans back. The first units attacked directly from the march, without time to familiarize themselves with the area, the layout of the Heer's positions, or even to resupply themselves with fuel and ammunition. The result was a slow-moving debacle. The fighting continued sporadically the rest of the week. On June 26th, the 12th Tank Division managed to penetrate the German lines. This penetration was paradoxically unexpected, yet it was the very purpose of the counterattack. There was no plan in place to support the division's penetration. The 16th Panzer was moved up as part of Kleist's previously mentioned reserves, and they stemmed the advance of the Soviet tanks. Just as this attack was culminating, the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance came through. They had found the command posts of the 2 Red Army Corps. The distinctive radio trucks had given away the 2 commanders. The Luftwaffe dispatched several groups of medium bombers and destroyed the nerve centers of the most dangerous counterattack the Heer was facing. Karpieza was wounded, and the commander of the 8th Mechanized, Lieutenant General Ryabchev, was unable to continue effective control of his units. He managed to get back in the saddle the next day. A real victory was still possible, despite all of the missteps and confusion. The 11th and 16th Panzer were cut off with parts of the 75th Infantry Division. The 8th Mechanized Corps had managed an envelopment. Front lines collapsed around Dubno as both sides became intermingled. The situation was stabilized by timely intervention by Kleist, who was greatly aided by the ability of his local commanders to keep a cool head. He directed an attack that cut off the unsupported corridor the 8th Mechanized had driven in their own attack. The 8th Mechanized was crushed in the middle of its own best chance for victory. Its vital connection to the rest of the Southwest Front cut before it could be stabilized. The rest of the situation deteriorated quickly. The German 6th Army arrived on the northern flank, and managed to push the remaining Red Army units back in confusion. The last day of solid resistance was the 30th of June. The Battle of Dubno was not the end of the Southwestern Front, but it was a perfect microcosm of the Soviet war machine as it stood in June 1941. Wasted opportunities, command inadequacies, and poor tactics contributed to the Red Army's failure across the front in the first week of the war. Units poorly organized their own attacks, defenses, and logistics. They rarely, if ever, coordinated with higher echelons or peer units. Soldiers fought with bravery and determination, but this alone is not how wars are won. Army Group South was in a strong position as the first week ended. There had been moments of crisis, but cool heads and strong coordination had gotten the soldiers through them. Luftwaffe reconnaissance and air support had worked well, but the area of operations was still comparatively small. Logistics had also not been a major issue for the field units yet. Panzers had worked well in conjunction with the infantry commanders, something that was not true everywhere during Operation Barbarossa's first week. This concludes our discussion for this week. Next week we will begin the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front, starting with the second week of the war. From June 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment and share this video. It helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.